Your leadership of the NIAF Fund Development Committee has ensured a successful gala and more support for NIAF scholarships. Thank you to all of your committee members, board members, and sponsors who've made tonight possible. A couple of weeks ago, I had the great honor of interviewing Dr. Anthony Fauci for tonight's program. We met via Zoom and talked about his Italian heritage, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, and of course, COVID-19. Please watch. Dr. Fauci, Tony, first of all, wonderful to see you. And in a few weeks, you're going to be honored by the National Italian Foundation at our 45th Anniversary Gala with NIAF's Leonardo da Vinci Award for Leadership in Health and Science. But for today, I thought it might be a great opportunity for the thousands of Italians and those who just love Italy watching the gala to get to know a little bit more about America's doctor, in addition to your achievements and lifelong service to the nation. So let's start with our shared heritage and hometown, Brooklyn, New York, where it all began. And at that time, when you and I were growing up in Brooklyn, it was a neighborhood of network of neighborhoods, Irish, Jewish, Italian, Puerto Rican, African American, with all of us going to the same schools. How did growing up in Italian in Brooklyn shape your childhood?
Well, as I'm sure anyone who's had that shared experience with me knows, it was a very nurturing and embracing atmosphere that you had your own immediate family, but at least the neighborhood that I grew up in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, right at 79th Street and New York Avenue, that was just an extended family. Literally, the family was the neighborhood. And I remember, comparing things of today when you're concerned about children who go to school, whether they can walk to school because you're afraid you don't want your children out on the street walking to school. I went to Our Lady of Guadalupe Elementary School, which was, whatever number of blocks away. And it was the safest walk in the world because all of the storekeepers and the people who'd be sitting out in front of their grocery stores and their hardware stores and things would always be watching out for the kids going by. So it was, an extended family that weren't blood relatives, but it was the entire neighborhood was your family. So that to me had a great influence on me because I have always been a people person, caring about people. And that was one of the things that drove me into medicine as a profession, is the idea of my inherent, ever since I was a child, as long as I could possibly remember, it was always people caring about each other. And that is the hallmark of the Italian American experience.
You're absolutely right. And I remember all those eyes watching. And God forbid, if you did something, your parents would know it. And so it was sort of this little telephone back and forth in a strong Italian-American neighborhood. And I imagine I know the answer, but those early values, your heritage, how are they guiding you today at this very interesting time in our nation's history?
Again, it does go back to that upbringing that we commonly share, is that in such great times of divisiveness, going through a very challenging historic pandemic, what you need if you want to be successful in addressing and ultimately conquering this terrible outbreak, you've got to be honest, you've got to be clear, you've got to be consistent, you've got to be trustworthy. And that was something that those were qualities that were part of the menu. I mean, you had to be honest, you had to be trustworthy. You always backed up your friends and the people who cared about you. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be what's going on in society today in general. But from the standpoint of the training, and it wasn't even training, it was part of your life. It wasn't like you went to school and trained. It was every single day of your life, you would see that. You would never betray a friend. You would never be dishonest with somebody. You would always be reliable. You would always cover your people's backs. That was it. I mean, that was a given. That was not something, that, you had to go to school to learn. It was a given part of the culture.
It was such a code, and it just brings me back to those days, hearing you talk about that, having one another's back. It was so, so important. And I know I can't even imagine today, but you've always worked 14 hours a day. And I think I read or heard that when your daughters were younger, you and your wife would actually sit down every night, although it was sometimes as late as 9 p.m., to have dinner with the family. And what I want to know is, how are those kids doing today? And are they still having dinner on Fauci time?
No, they are adult, working, professional women, all three of them. But they are doing fine. They are great. They were amazingly supportive of the unusual lifestyle that I had to develop because of the demands on my time during crisis after crisis after crisis. During their young years, the major crisis was HIV, which I was devoted to. But then remember, we also had 9/11 that was followed by the anthrax attacks, when we thought we were going to have bioterrorism, and that consumed my time as much, if not more, because of its intensity, than HIV/AIDS. So they have always known me as somebody that was responding to a crisis. So for them, crisis management and crisis response was part of everyday living. So they felt if I came home at 8:30 or 9 o'clock to eat dinner, they adjusted their schedules so that they would have meals with us. So, the one thing that has always been sacrosanct in Italian-American families, that you sit down with the family together at dinner. Well, we couldn't do that at 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 because of my schedule, but they adjusted perfectly well to that. I'm not so sure it's so healthy eating that late at night, but they seem to do very well because they're very healthy young adult women.
And it seems there's a trajectory here. Your parents owned and operated a pharmacy, and you delivered the prescriptions. How old were you then?
Oh, I was anywhere from 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 during those years with my Schwinn bike with its little basket in the front that you would dump the little bags of prescriptions in and zip around the neighborhood.
I thought that was you.
I was pretty reckless then. I used to go pretty fast on the bike.
You mentioned before in terms of public service, but did your dad have an influence on your decision to go into medicine?
Well, not in going in medicine, but he was an interesting man. I mean, obviously, I have a great deal of love and respect for him as a father, but he was very much a non-materialistic public service type person. Because I remember in the drugstore things that he used to do when people couldn't pay for the prescriptions because they were having difficulty financially. He would essentially give it to them for free. I mean, try to get that done in a CVS today. Yeah, go to your Walgreens or your CVS and try to walk out without paying for the prescription. See how far you get. But he used to do that regularly. So we didn't make a lot of money at all. We just had enough to get along. It's a good thing that I've gotten scholarships throughout all of my schooling because they didn't have to pay a dime for my schooling because of scholarships. But his concern was taking care of his customers, who were the neighborhood. Getting back to what we said, Pat, just a moment ago, that culture of taking care of each other, he did that as the pharmacist in the neighborhood who did that. So it wasn't a question of making money. It was just a question of serving the public. But
that's such a great early, strong start. And but you're also the product of Jesuit education, high school and college. And the Jesuits have been turning out leaders for more than 400 years, prepared to go out into the world. And how did that experience shape your decision to really focus completely on public service?
Well, it cemented it in me. I get asked that question all the time. It clearly started with my parents.
Yeah.
But when you go to a Jesuit school, it's very explicit. I mean, the motto,
tough, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, quite. The motto of Regis High School was "Men for Others."
Wow.
So, I mean, it's explicitly stated in the title of the mandate of the school that you serve others. So I think the 4 years at Regis High School, right in the middle of Manhattan, really solidified the kinds of things that I naturally got from the time I was a baby, before even I realized what was going on. I got that from my parents. But then high school and college, which was also a Jesuit school, Holy Cross, continued that spirit of service and intellectual rigor.
Well, I was thinking about this in light of what we're all going through today. And the Jesuits teach that we should live with enthusiasm, with joy, with gusto. And that's very much part of the Italian culture. But how can we really do this at a time of great peril and anxiety? I think a lot of people want to know what sustains you.
Well, what sustains me, Pat, is the importance and the significance of the problem that I'm addressing. We're right now, in the middle of, and the end is not necessarily in sight, in the middle of a historic pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in 102 years since 1918. Getting worn out, getting burned out, getting too tired to go any further is not an option. I mean, that's just it. That's not in the cards. No matter how many hours you work, no matter how worn out you feel, you just got to keep going, because the problem is of such a magnitude, you just can't let it get ahead of you.
It reminds me, I remember that debate, President George H.W. Bush, in a debate with Michael Dukakis, I think, and he was talking about sports heroes, and he said that it's great to honor them. And then he said, but Anthony Fauci is a real hero, strong and smart. So that must have been an incredible moment. It's great to be smart, but strong is also important.
Well, now that was wonderful of President, at that time, Vice President George H.W. Bush, when he was debating in the presidential debate with Michael Dukakis. It really surprised me completely when he said that, because they asked Michael Dukakis who his heroes were, and somehow or other his staff must not have prepped him very well, because he fumbled around a little bit about trying to figure out one. And when they asked Vice President George H.W. Bush, he first gave the name of a Latino teacher who was devoting his life to teaching minority kids. And then he said, and then there's also, and all of a sudden we almost fainted when we heard about it, that he said, then there's Anthony Fauci. And he said, you probably never heard of him. And Ann Compton raised her hand and said, oh, I've heard of him. And he said, yeah. And he started telling what I did. But I just think that was a reflection of how great Vice President, then ultimately President George H.W. Bush was, in his ability to connect to real people. Mm-hmm. Because he got to know me because he came right here to the NIH where I'm sitting right now, because he wanted to learn about HIV infected people. And this was when he was still vice president, because he knew it was important and he needed to pay more attention. So he's another example of, I think he's not an Italian American, but he certainly cared about people.
NIAF has been working, of course, early on during COVID through the Italian ambassador to the United States, Armando Verricchio, the American ambassador to the Republic of Italy, Lou Eisenberg, to be of assistance. And I think you've already answered this, but one of our board members, John Rosa, now I mentioned his name, so I'll be very happy. He wanted for you to particularly address this, because the virus, of course, has taken its toll on both Italy and the US. And he wants to know, do you think there'll be an increase in what is called diseases of despair, depression, loneliness, substance abuse, lasting past the time the virus is controlled?
Well, there certainly are a very significant uptick now in diseases of despair, for sure. But you ask a good question. Is that going to trigger something that'll last beyond? I think it will linger. I think there'll be a bit of a post-traumatic stress syndrome among some people with this. I think it's pretty clear that that will happen. But I would hope that we have enough resiliency in our society of people of all ethnic and racial backgrounds, the entire country.
Right.
I think has enough resiliency that after a while, and I hope it's a short while, people will get back to the optimism and the hope that has been so characteristic of our country and not the despair that seems to be settling in now.
Well, along those same lines, we have so many young adults who are going to be watching the gala. Thousands of people will be watching. And of course, their lives have been disrupted. Their inability perhaps to pursue careers. And what would you tell them about some kind of realistic hope for the future?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I emphasize that a lot now, Pat. I would say there will be an end to this. I know sometimes it feels like, we've been going through this since February. So you're talking 8 months and it's going to end, guarantee. We're going to get a vaccine and the vaccine is going to diminish the infection rate, that together with good public health measures. It's going to take a while to gradually get back to the normal that we knew it in its original form, but we will get back gradually to some form of normality, little by little, and then we will be there. So you don't want people to despair, throw their hands up in the air and say, we're never going to see the end, so what's the difference? Let's just go out and do what we want to do. No, I think that is the wrong approach, that you've got to realize that the end is in sight. Just hang in there, do the kind of things you need to do, stick together, work this out together, and we'll be fine.
And I hope more young people start considering careers in medicine and science and public service, which NIAF is encouraging. And for decades, you have been on the front lines, really communicating to the public in such a direct and honest way about these very complicated infectious diseases. And I know you've answered this so many times, but I don't think we can hear it enough. How can we break this trajectory and resurgence of this or other pandemics so we're not really lurching from openness to shutdown and back again for the long term?
Well, that's a good way to pose that question, Pat, because we've got to get away from this thought that it's either shut down completely or let caution to the wind. And that's what I think we saw when certain of the southern states and now Midwest and Northwest states started to so-called open America again to try and open the economy, that they felt so constrained during the shutdown that instead of abiding by the prudent and careful recommendations of gateway phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 opening, some of the places, states, cities, counties, went from shutdown to hanging out at bars with no masks in a crowded situation, congregating in rooms indoor with no masks. That's a perfect setup and an invitation to a disaster. And unfortunately, the reality is, we can't deny it, that that's what's happening right now. If you look at the reports, we were going down for a while. There are still some states that are doing well, but many states are starting to rebound now. And that's very dangerous as we go into the cooler months of the fall and the colder months of the winter, when people are doing things more indoor versus outdoor. The threat and the risk of having a resurgence of cases is much, much greater when you get into cold weather. So we've really got to get our act together and start all across the board uniformly doing those public health measures of uniform wearing of masks, keep a physical distance, avoid crowds, doing things outdoors more than indoors, washing your hands, those types of things.
Well, we're going to follow that, Dr. Fauci. And I have one more really hard-hitting question for you. Why do you keep coming back to the NIAF Gala year after year? It can't just be the pasta.
Well, the pasta is good. You've got to say that. And it's amazing. I can't imagine how we do it every year where you have so many people in a room and it's always al dente. I can't figure out how they did that so well. It's pretty good. Some people can't do it for 4 people, but when you do it for that number of people, well, it's because of the spirit and the old friends. It's great to see people, some of those people you don't see for a year or even longer. To see them again, it always spontaneously creates a festive atmosphere. So even though you're doing it virtually, it's still a little bit of the same. It's still getting together.
Well, I just want you to know, when you are in one of the middle of your 14 to 16-hour days, the great love and affection we have for you and the appreciation for keeping us safe and truly caring about every single American. And now there are several people who want to express their appreciation for your service to our country. And we're going to begin with a tribute from one Tony to another. Thank you so much. So good to see you. Stay safe.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much. You too. Hang in there.
We will.
I love you. Take care.
I love you. Bye-bye. Thanks.